my role encompasses working with a design practice and dealing with technology. So I kind of it meshes very well with, I think, the content of this event. However, I'm going to talk in particular now about a project that we've done and talk about the archive that we've developed as part of our work on that project. That's the King's Cross project. I'll give you some overview of both the kind of content and range of material that we gather through our work. And then I'll talk in a little bit more detail about the sort of the issues that dealing with digital and physical component within that archive poses us with, and also sort of give you some views from our perspective on some interesting content that working with digital data presents to us. Yeah. Now the King's Cross Project Archive, which is the title of the presentation, really needs to be interrogated, actually. And the first thing we can do, I think, is look at the project. And one of the interesting things about the project, I think, particularly King's Cross, is that it's both in its physical manifestation and its representation is seen as a kind of unified whole. It has a clarity to it that makes it very attractive. And actually, one of the interesting things that misses is the complex nature of our endeavour on the project. For a start, the project was inevitably, with a project this size, it was subdivided into packages. And not only that, but our role on each of the sub-packages was different. So whilst we had an overarching role as architect for the project, we also had very, very specific contractual relationships on each of the separate packages. And I think that's quite important to understand when we talk about the project archive, because actually what we're not talking about is actually a project archive. We're talking about a specific document of an experience on the project, and that experience is specific to us. And although with regard to our role on the project, we are probably the best placed agents to develop and present that archive, it nevertheless remains a particular viewpoint. And due to the complex nature of the project and the number of people who are working on the project, there could actually feasibly be a number of different archives with a very different manifestation to them, actually. So that's the kind of first view. The second view would be a temporal view, and actually this project has the longest gestation period of any project I think we've ever done. So it's something about 16 years. The various packages were procured at different stages through that 16 years. Obviously, our involvement grew, shrank, stopped, restarted, and hence through that timeline, the practice has changed. The practice has changed in terms of, CAD, the way we work, the way we do drawings, the way we record our drawings. CAD was kind of in its adoption phase, I would suggest, at the inception of the project. And somewhere towards the sort of mid-portion of the project, the mid-2000s, CAD then sort of became ubiquitous in our endeavour. So everyone working in practice would be based on CAD. So that's one change. There are also changes in terms of how we approach a digital archive. In terms of understanding, for a start, the quantity of digital data that we're producing on a project suddenly became an issue when we're starting to produce it. So how do we do it? And actually the nature of the way we archive that has changed quite significantly, from a very static process of putting things on CDs to now being in a situation where we're more or less live, real-time archiving as we go along. So we can access from that archive as needed. in addition, there are other aspects of the way we store and retrieve digital data, in particular Open Asset, which is our archive for a vast photography archive, and that's actually fundamental to the way we work, and that process, that asset was only introduced right towards the end of this project. So the project has seen quite a deal of change in the way we approach digital issues. Again, coming back to this point of the project archive, actually there is no one project. Actually, there's 40 sub-projects, and although some of these relate to a technical kind of accounting-led disaggregation of the data, many of them actually refer to radically different packages of work that we're producing. So actually we could say that there are 40 separate archives that we could look at, and the connections and the structure of those might in themselves be quite interesting. Within each project, within each package, within each sub-work stream, if you like, we've kind of thought that maybe we can start to list the modes in which we produce stuff. And this covers both digital and physical work. And this is a kind of very, very basic taxonomy that we've kind of tried to derive. And what I'll do is I'll go through these sort of individual categories, and I'll give some expression of or an idea of what kind of stuff it sits in any of these categories. However, in going through the categories, I'm going to try and suggest that these categories are problematic, particularly when we come into the nature of our digital archive, whereby what we're actually seeing increasingly is not digital artifacts that have a kind of one-to-one correspondence with items on the project, but actually what we're looking at are a series of very, very complex interconnections between digital files. And actually it makes less and less sense to talk of a drawing as opposed to a photograph, as opposed to a report, for example. So, very quickly I'm going to just look at these and start to talk about some of those issues. And I won't talk about the actual, maybe the size or the nature of the content until later. I'll touch on how we deal with that after this overview. But just sort of going through this sort of section, the most important section of our production, I think, is documents, and we produce documents all the time, specifically to convey our design intent. We produce drawings, and these form probably, I would suggest, about a quarter of the entire archive in terms of digital volume, if you want to call it that. Even that's problematic. I'll come back to that in a second. The interesting thing about these drawings is that, coming back to that idea of digital connections within the archive, is that actually these drawings, if you interrogate them, are actually quite insubstantial things. And actually what they are re-representations or re-symbolizations of data sitting elsewhere in an archive. So what these drawings are collections of digital data represented or re-symbolized in a certain way for a particular purpose. And we'll look in detail at what that means in a minute. But actually that same problem appears to us whenever we start to interrogate any of the archive we have. So, for instance, reports, which are probably the second, most important documentary bit of work we produce, are composed of, are actually recollections and reconfigurations of other work. So representations of photographic archives, of models, of drawings, and so on. Actually, if you do look at our report archive, these bottom two I was going to point out actually are really quite, amongst them are really quite interesting artifacts. I mean, they're all interesting. They all express some kind of moment in the project. But these two at the bottom, for instance, from my perspective, are particularly interesting. They form kind of evidence of a very early development of, in this case, space syntax analysis of the site. And this is at the very early stage of the project. And actually, you can see there and revisit this in the light of quite radical changes in space syntax methodology. And these are really historical documents, actually, as they all are. We very often give a core part of our work is giving visual expression to our design, and we do this in-house. We do this by commissions, especially, and all these are computer-generated images at some level of resolution. Again, they are the end result, the end manifestation of a series of operations that relies on disaggregated bits of digital data that sits in our archive. And although these are snapshots in time, my kind of contention is that they are, and although they add value to the project, my contention is that they're not as interesting as the underlying data and the underlying structure. And here's another example of the kind of resymbolization, if you like, of our digital data that we produce. And when this goes in an archive, and I'm presenting it to you now as items in an archive, it's kind of important to remember that these are just snapshots of the digital state of the project at any one point in time. So it would be virtually impossible to go back and recreate these now from our existing digital data set, because our data set has changed now. So these are snapshots in time. Still, documentary evidence, I suppose you would call it, is a vast photography archive that we've accumulated throughout the whole life cycle of the project. From the very early stages, a mixture of informal site photos and commissioned work documenting the state of the project and the environment around the building prior to work. And these are really quite interesting and quite there's a massive archive, actually, that we can draw on, as well as an extensive archive of commissioned material documenting the state of the fabric of the building prior to our work. And a lot of this has been incorporated in reports, as you've seen. A lot of it actually sits in our archive, and there's a massive material that we can access, but it kind of lies there, and is a real repository of knowledge in that sense. Throughout the work on the project, we've kind of incessantly documented our work and the work of the various project partners on site. So these actually, and there is a time-lapse sequence that I'm not going to show you, but kind of rather interestingly shows the sequence and configuration of the work. So in a real sense, this is a document of, again, a snapshot in time, the time being the construction phase of the project. We can document, and we have documented, the work of individual subcontractors and the way they use our data and the way they operate. And these techniques are constantly changing. In this instance, this foundry was casting the nodes, the trees, as one of the very first instances of actually using the digital data direct in its 3D form. So this was a kind of an interesting document in that sense. It's a record of a changing process. We can also document the people that have been working on the project, so the completion photograph, as well as the trades on site, and the process of design as well. So there's site work and there's work going on in the studio. There's obviously various interested people taking part in that. We can document that. And we document all the kind of sort of the cloud of events that goes on around such a project as well. So presentations, royal visits, and so on. As well, obviously, as actually documenting the building, the project as it stands. So a massive archive of that kind of material, and actually not just the obvious stuff. I mean, the concourse the Western Concourse Roof is the high-profile part of the project, and that's where everyone goes and everyone thinks of as King's Cross. But there's a massive heritage content in the project as well, which again has been kind of forensically documented, both from the early phase of the project, its existing state, to the work on site, to this sort of sequence of images, which is a small part of a massive archive actually of documentary evidence of repair to the heritage fabric of the project. Okay. As well as, I call that documentary work, we've developed, as part of our work, we naturally need to work in spatial ways. So very often that's represented in the form of physical models. And you've probably seen a couple of the models actually here on display. And there is an archive of very, very beautiful models that document design work in progress, from presentation models to the sort of white cardboard type working models that we would use as part of our design process, through to investigative models looking at sectional relationships in the concourse, for example. But also more sort of interestingly from the digital perspective, that idea of modelling probably around the time of the challenge placed by the design of the concourse roof, we started to get into digital modelling. And the purpose for this, as a collaborative exercise between John McAslan Partners and Arup, who are the engineers and the lead designers on this element of the project, was not just to produce a kind of a spatial representation of the building, but actually to produce analytical models. So what you've got here are, I was going to say digital representations representing an aspect of a model, but actually not showing the true data and the true value of these models, which lies in the analytical output. Now, these are structural models, okay, so they are analysing the performance, the anticipated performance of the roof structurally. And this was an iterative process that went on quite intensively through the design phase of the project and resulted in many, many digital models, all of which we can access, we can represent, but actually whose true value lies in their content, in their digital content. And here's some examples of that digital content, again being represented in a visual sense to aid some option testing for the funnel. If you could believe it, the funnel was never always going to be like that. It may have actually been very, very radically different, but that needed to be tested, and it was done through the realm of, or through the mode of digital 3D modelling. Not only structurally, but also acoustically and in terms of lighting conditions. So these models were all really intensively tested digitally to verify the design, actually. Of course, there were instances where we worked both in physical and digital mode. Digital mode being very easy because we can assemble things quickly and then change them equally quickly and represent them, take a snapshot of them very easily. So that's a very accessible way for us to model in a way that maybe physical modelling doesn't give us, although both domains are very important to us. And still in the realm of modelling, this is kind of taking a step further, and these are actually spatial models. The two images on the left are they are quite small on the wall. Are analyses of anticipated pedestrian movement through the Western Concourse and through the new public square. So these are representations of human density at peak times during the day. So these are models. Actually, these models exist, and again, this is an image of the model in action. But it's an analytical model, and it runs and produces vast amounts of digital data. The two images on the right that you probably can't see because they're very dark are agent-based models, modelling, if you like, dynamic flows of people through the concourse to try and understand the likely condition of human movement through the building. And this obviously is done before the building's constructed. The image in the centre is a space syntax study of the building, the station, and its content, and again represented in a particular way. But that representation being based on a very, very, very rich data model that exists, and into which we can interrogate and produce these kind of representations. But the representations have their own problems. We need to understand that we're representing digital data in a certain form when we do these kind of things. I was actually going to play a little animation, but I think I'm just going to skip through it because I may be going a little bit. Okay, well, we'll skip the animation. Okay. Needless to say, we've got a lot of animations which are based on the same data set. Samples. Okay, physical samples. We store them. We've got them. We load downstairs. We also photograph them. And here's some digital images of the real thing. We also got record of how we deal with physical samples. So a digital record of approvals, processes, inspections, quality reports on materials, and so forth. So there's a kind of documentation of a process of choosing and specifying those material samples as well. One of the interesting things about having this vast array of data available to us is that we are constantly, throughout the course of the project and subsequently, recombining those bits of information in terms of presentations. And we have an archive of presentation material that forms its own area of interest as well, including, if you probably have noticed, this presentation itself, actually, which in a kind of provocative little way I've included in this presentation in a sort of logical Mobius strip. Now this presentation actually doesn't add anything in terms of production, but I've recombined these existing artifacts from the archive in a new way, and thereby added 143 megabytes to our archive, curiously. As well as that, we've got a mass of kind of collaterals of the stuff that we've produced. So books, guides. Arup, for instance, who've been obviously very heavily involved in the project, have produced curated their own archive in a sense, and they represented that in their own journal, and that is a document of their work, and then that in turn has come into our archive. So that in itself is a kind of an interesting sub part of the archive. And actually, I think the summary of that, of looking at all those things, is actually to say that these categories are a little bit kind of suspect, really. And they're suspect because we're dealing with digital information and digital representations of physical information. So I'm going to talk very quickly about some of the issues that this kind of raises as far as we're concerned. When it comes to managing our data, we have to be, we're very pragmatic, and the source data, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a second. The source data that underlies all the project. So I'm not talking necessarily about the finished product, the finished drawing, the image board that's pinned on the wall. The source data we have to curate very carefully. and we do it to ensure the fidelity and the robustness of our work. And we can see that there's sort of so many 100 gigabytes, probably about half a terabyte, I would say, in total across the project, of that kind of digital information. We actually archive it. If you say archive, our archiving strategy with regard to that data is based on disaster recovery, actually. And it's done automatically, it's stored digitally off-site, but we have instant access to that anytime we want. So we can restore stuff from archive anytime we want. And we kind of need that, actually, very often, because we want to access historical work and what have you. So actually, in terms of an archive, the only archive that exists is here on our servers. And we have some CDs that were archived prior to 2003 that I think are probably just coming to the end of their lifetime. So we need to put them on our network and get those archived to tape. So, but it's a very pragmatic approach we take, and the responsibility for that is mine, as someone who's involved in the process, the day-to-day process of using digital data in the course of the project. However, a lot of the other digital image we use is digital data we use is based around images, particularly photographs. And we've got a massive and very well organised digital database using ProjectWise, which we can search for any of our images by project or by content, or by date, or in just about any field you can imagine, actually. However, that archive, that database actually only covers about just over a half of the total archive of known photographs that we've got on our network, which is probably about 51 gigabytes in total. So there's lots of stuff that that exists there and that we use and we combine in our work into documents and into other forms that kind of sits out with of our archiving, our managed archiving component, if you like. In terms of you won't be able to see this at all, apart from that, there's colours on the pie chart. But in terms of how King's Cross compares with the rest of our work, well, I've said probably about half a terabyte of information. But what does that mean? Actually, that includes duplications and documents embedded in other documents, and documents that reference 10 other documents that in turn reference other documents. So in total, about half a terabyte out of about 80 terabytes total capacity on our network. And we're adding to that at the rate of about 60 gigabytes per month. And actually, if you look at the 10 top projects in our office, King's Cross is probably equivalent to the largest project that we're currently procuring at the moment, which is that green slice of the pie. That's our total CAD archive, if you like, our total CAD network, should we say. And actually that will probably, our digital record of King's Cross will probably be overtaken fairly soon by projects as they're coming along now, because of the growth in the sophistication and the quality of the digital data that we're producing on these projects. Just to, I think, kind of delve into a bit more detail with regard to this kind of issue of complexity in the digital data and the structure of the digital data as being an important aspect of the archive. This is a page taken from our Digital Production Standards Manual, and this is a guide for architects on how to produce a drawing and how to work in a digital realm to produce a digital artifact that looks like a drawing. Okay. And the key important thing about this, I think, is that actually we've got something called an outgoing sort of area. And actually, what that is that's a snapshot of the project at a time. So anytime you see a drawing pinned on the wall, that's a snapshot of a particular piece of data. And the way that's composed is that there's actually a drawing file. And there's one drawing file for one digital print, if you want to put it that way. However, in composing that file itself draws on whichever digital source files we need to represent on that drawing. And I hope this is making sense, but the design, in effect, takes place here. And the design for any project will compose of many, many different files containing disaggregated data. And what's important is the combination of those bits of disaggregated data into the final product. Not only that, what's important in producing this design data is that there are at least two other levels of configuration, if you like, or resources that support that design. So we're talking about project standards that inform the representation, crude things like the colour, the line weight, the line style of any bit of data that we draw. So actually, what's important in the way we work is a whole description of the structure of the digital data, and I was going to show you these. This is an example of what that means. This is a drawing, okay, of King's Cross, and that's the sort of thing that would maybe, well, not this one because this is quite boring, but something like that might be put on the wall as evidence of a design process. However, if we kind of switch off the symbolization of that shows the sheet and the nice background and all that kind of stuff, what we see actually in that file is a whole load of digital data that we can peel away levels of that data to reveal actually something interesting. And that interesting thing is that the drawing file itself contains nothing other than text or annotation, and all the information is contained in the original source digital files. Here's another example, a bit more complex. This is a plan of the gate line in King's Cross. If we turn off the symbolization, what we have is you can see that symbolization, that drawing, was a very, very simplified view of a very, very complex set of disaggregated data. In this case, disaggregated across 10 or 12 separate files, each of which are combined and represented in a specific way in the digital drawing. So if I turn off every single one of these files, you notice that, again, this is kind of nested data that can make kind of very little sense on its own. It's only when it's combined that it makes sense. And actually, on the King's Cross project, if we're looking at this sort of design area, and you can't really see these, but this is actually a view into one of our folders containing our model data. So these are all the files that represent the design, in a sense. There's over 1,600 files for this sub-element of this package alone. Okay, and they are all cryptically named. So again, if you don't have the knowledge of the entire structure, data structure, no layperson, no person coming into this project without any understanding of the project would know what any of those files represent or what their value is. In turn, those 1,600 files are combined in various different ways to produce something like 243, I think, drawings in this instance. And each drawing being ultimately a representation of a collection of digital files combined in a certain way and then represented in a certain way. So that actually goes to the heart of the way we work. We work along a timeline in a project. And in the timeline of the project, we curate data. We create model data, which represents the design. But at key points in the project, we will then extract that data in the form of a drawing, or in the form of a 3D model, or a visualization, or a report. But what's important to us as architects is the maintenance, the structure and the robustness of that digital data in what we call a workspace or a managed environment. And actually that applies whether we're talking in terms of a historic project like King's Cross, or a project that is being procured using new techniques such as BIM, for example. The techniques are exactly the same. It's just that the sophistication of the data improves. And finally, probably right on time, hopefully, just very quickly, just to give the last part of the jigsaw in terms of how we manage our archive. I've talked about the digital component in terms of our drawing and our modelling and our design. I've also talked about the digital component for image, managing the image library. We do actually have a physical component as well that we manage, and actually that is in the same way that we're quite pragmatic about that, and that the digital is owned by me, the imagery is owned by an image librarian, so the physical component is owned by Office Manager, and that's the basis of her organisation of that archive is again quite pragmatically based on organisation space in the office. So we do have stuff that we collect. We always you'll probably see it when you go up in the studio. Stuff all over the place. Periodically, that is archived, and we've currently got about just over 3,000 items in off-site storage.
Boxes?
They're boxes, yeah.
3,000
items being a box or a roll of drawings, and they're kept for. Well, I think that the contract is 25 years to keep those. Obviously, we've got to keep records for professional reasons as well. Of those 3,000 items, curiously, only 105 of them are in the King's Cross archive, and that consists of a range of materials you can see here. So there's 29 items that relating to hard copy correspondence alone, which is currently off-site. In addition, we have a deal of stuff that is physical artifacts, samples, models that remain on site. However, that will change, and we're in the process of organising that, cataloguing that, and making that available to us as a sort of more robust, if you like, record of our work on the project. And I think that probably was it. In fact, it is it. So thank you.